News from the African continent has taken centre stage in recent months. The deadly Ebola virus, the spread of Islamist extremism, and conflict in countries such as South Sudan and the Central African Republic are all cause for global concern. Joining me to discuss some of these issues are Dr. Nkosazana Zuma, Chair of the African Union Commission, and California Congresswoman Karen Bass. Welcome, ladies. The Ebola crisis, obviously that has hit the headlines. What is the African Union doing to try and help stem the spread of this disease?
Well, the African Union is coordinating the countries first to have the same understanding of the disease and to have a coordinated collective response to it. We are mobilizing our countries to give support to these countries, financial, in-kind, human resources, give information, accurate information about how the disease is spread and what people should do to try and prevent them getting themselves infected. We have identified the fact that they don't have enough human resources. We have sent a team to Liberia, which is there already. We are sending another team to Sierra Leone this weekend, and we'll be sending another team to Guinea. But really, the whole world needs to come together. I'm glad the UN has come on board as well to ensure that these countries have enough financial resources, treatment centers, logistics, protective clothing, information out there and personnel out there to stem the disease. But beyond that, when the epidemic has declined, we still need to build the health infrastructure, public health infrastructure, so that they are able to respond should something like this happen in future. But also, we must not forget that there will be socio-economic impact that might be even more than the disease itself.
What is that, Dr. Zuma? What type of social
Well,
economic impact
socio-economic impact, for instance, people are not working in the fields, so which means there'll probably be problems with food. Some companies have shut shop, flights are not flying, few boats are docking. So all those things mean that the economic activities in the countries have declined, and therefore even their GDPs have been revised down. And yet it was those countries that were really doing well after coming out of difficult situations.
And Dr. Zuma, what happens to people if you have a common cold, malaria, or another preventable disease? What happens to you now that Ebola has taken center stage?
Well, that's the other problem, because now everybody is so focused on Ebola that the common diseases that people get treatment for, they are no longer getting adequate treatment for that. And that's what we must also pay attention to.
Congresswoman Bass, we've had our first diagnosed case of Ebola in this country. Obviously, people are really afraid. What should the US be doing? Should there be better screening at airports? Should they prevent carriers from going to countries in West Africa?
Well, I absolutely don't think that should happen. I think the number one thing that we need to do is the general public in the United States needs to be better informed about Ebola and to understand that even though we might have 1 or 2 cases in the United States, there will not be a massive breakout of Ebola, because we do have fundamentally a strong health system that can diagnose and that can isolate patients, which is why you've seen the cases that have come from Africa. They've all survived and they've been okay, and I certainly wish the best to the current case. But I know that he's in intensive care, he's receiving treatment, and I think it's very important that we not become hysterical and stigmatize people. So you mentioned the socioeconomic impact. You know, most of the country's chocolate in the United States comes from West Africa.
Right.
And so now there is a concern in the Ivory Coast, for example, that the harvest of the cocoa won't make it because the companies are afraid to go in. And it's the basic education that needs to take place so that people are not overly fearful, and that, you know, 1, hysteria doesn't break out here, and 2, we don't do additional harm to the African countries.
And of course, the US has deployed certain troops
Right.
to the region. What's their role going to
Right.
be?
Well, I'm very happy about that. I mean, what President Obama did is deploy troops, but the troops are there to set up hospitals.
Right.
And the U.S. military, in terms of their logistical expertise and capacity, can do that very quick. In addition, the military is going to be involved in training healthcare workers, because as the chairwoman mentioned, it's one thing to have everyone go in and try to be helpful, but at the end of the day, you need healthcare workers. And you know that many of the deaths initially were deaths of healthcare workers. So I think that our response has been good, but the other thing the president did was went to the United Nations and attempted to rally the world. This is a crisis that absolutely can be dealt with. This disease can be contained, but it's going to take a commitment of the entire world to do that.
Absolutely. Well, switching gears a bit to the issue of terrorism. Africa, some have said, is now this kind of new fertile ground for the rise of Islamic extremism and terrorism. Dr. Zuma, where is this coming from? Why is this happening, and what is the AU doing to try and suppress this?
Well, first I think it's important to say yes, there is terrorism in Africa, but in a few areas. It's not a widespread problem yet. And I think the approach that the AU is taking is that we should deal with it in a multidimensional way. It should not just be military. We should be looking at working with a lot of stakeholders, including faith leaders, religious leaders, to talk to young people, to communities about what Islam, what other religions are, and that they do not actually advocate this kind of behavior. So we need to de-radicalize our youth. Secondly, it's very important to get our youth skilled so that they can get jobs, they can create jobs, so that they have a stake in the future of their countries. It's also important to have democracies that are participatory, where nobody feels, or no group of people feel, marginalized. And even economically, people must feel they are part of the country's economic activity. So the management of diversity is also very important. So we think it should be really multi-dimensional. It shouldn't just be military only.
Right, and Congresswoman Bass, how is the US helping? You know, we hear the headlines, we hear Boko Haram in West Africa, Al-Shabaab in East Africa, offshoots of Al-Qaeda, and people, you know, are kind of, you know, the hair rises on their arms. I mean,
right, well, I think one of the most important things in the United States is to recognize that Africa is a continent with 54 countries. And if you have a problem in terrorism in 4 or 5 countries, that does not mean that it has impacted the entire continent, and the majority of the continent is peaceful. So the United States is helping. For example, in the instance of Boko Haram, we have sent military advisors in. We've also provided drone support in helping to find the girls that have been kidnapped. But I think the most important way the United States can help is to help address some of the root causes, because when people don't feel they have a lot of options, then they do get involved in negative activity. And so some of the investments that have been made in programs such as Feed the Future, which is a way to help Africa develop the ability to feed itself as opposed to being an importer of food. So we have very specific programs that are focused on development. There's a trade agreement that expires at the end of next year. And to the extent that we can help address the economic issues in Africa, infrastructure, all of those issues, I think that's the way you get at it. Because again, if people are hopeless, that's when they can be recruited by terrorists. If we can help raise the economic stability of countries, that's a way to get at this issue.
Well, we're talking about how the US might help on the African continent. I'd like you both to address this question in terms of US-Africa relations today. President Obama has actually said that this is a new era.
Right.
Is the US doing enough, first of all, Dr. Zuma? We see China kind of steering the ship, and it's almost as if the US has missed the boat.
Well, I think the US invests in Africa, but they invest in the extractive industry. On the whole, there are few companies that do invest in other things. But I think it's important now for US companies to invest in agriculture, to invest in energy, especially renewable energies, to invest in infrastructure, to invest in technology, and at the same time invest and train young people in their companies. So I think so far I don't think they are doing enough of that. And I think the part of the reason we thought the summit was a good idea was...
And you're referring to the recent Africa summit in Washington,
yes,
correct? Yes.
Was to get the message across, coming from everybody, coming from the government, coming from Congress, coming from business people, that Africa is a continent of endless opportunities, and the time to explore those opportunities is now. And of course, it's not waiting for the US. Everybody else is exploring those opportunities. And if the US doesn't come, it probably will miss the boat. I don't think they've missed the boat. I think there's still big opportunities to be explored.
I will tell you, the chairwoman is a diplomat. I think that the United States view of Africa is backward. I think that I'm worried that we're very late, that many other countries around the world recognize the opportunities on the continent of Africa. I think we are beginning to catch up, certainly within Congress. The good news is that U.S.-Africa relations is a bipartisan issue. We work well together, Democrats and Republicans, and I will mention a piece of legislation that was recently passed out of the House that is in the Senate. It's called Electrify Africa. It's to support President Obama's initiative to support the infrastructure on the continent of Africa, and that's in terms of electricity, because there is a large part of the continent that doesn't have access to electricity. So if you are going to develop the economies, you need transportation, you need rail, you need air carriers, and you also need electricity. So I think that U.S. businesses need to be far more involved, and we need to change the way we view the continent. The slogan on the continent now is trade, not aid. We still view the continent from the perspective of charity and what the continent needs, as opposed to the rest of the world, which sees the continent of Africa as an equal partner. And that's where the United States needs to be, and we're not there now.
Just to wrap up, Dr. Zuma, you are the first female chair of the African Union Commission. How significant is that, and what does that mean to the African woman, who essentially is the backbone of the continent?
Well, I think it's a great step forward. As you know, when the OAU changed to African Union in 2002, there was a solemn declaration that required every member state to work towards parity in decision making in all areas of human endeavor. And since then, countries have worked very hard to get to that. And none of us are there, but in some areas, some have reached and surpassed. If we take decision making in parliament, the country that leads with the majority of women in parliament is an African, Rwanda at 64%. Wow. And others are coming on, 40-something percent, 50%, 30%. So there is a move. We've seen many more ministers in cabinets. We're seeing even chief justices. We're seeing some women being appointed as governors of reserve banks. So, and in academia, we see women taking leading positions. So there is a real move towards that parity. Still a long way, but you can see the movement. And I think it was in the context of that that I was also elected. And I think part of electing women in high-profile positions is to also give young women and other women role models to say it's possible. We can reach there. I remember when I went to Parliament the first time in '94, I met one lady in the street and she said to me, "Oh, we look at you guys in Parliament every day and we stand our ground in the factories."
Right.
So I think it's that kind. But it's also important when you are in that position to try and bring up many more women. As somebody said, when you climb, you don't push the ladder when you reach the top.
Right.
You leave it on so that more people can climb on it.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, ladies. Thank you, Dr. Zuma, Congresswoman Bass. For more on this story and other stories about Africa, please visit latimes.com and follow us on Twitter @LATimes.